There's a moment I keep coming back to, and I've turned it over in my mind probably 1,000 times since it happened. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the frost hasn't quite decided if it's staying, and I was standing in the driveway of the most expensive house I'd ever set foot on, holding a cracked leather work glove in one hand and a thermos of gas station coffee in the other, and I had absolutely no business being there. My name is Travis Kemp. I'm a plumber. Have been for going on 19 years. I work out of a one-truck operation in Barrie, Ontario, my apprentice Dylan, and a scheduling app my daughter set up on my phone that I still don't fully understand. I am not the kind of man who gets invited to places like that house, and I want to be upfront about something from the start. I almost didn't go in, but I did. And within 40 minutes of walking through that front door, I was going to do something that a team of contractors, a structural engineer and a very expensive consultant from Toronto, had spent 3 weeks unable to do. And I was going to do it because of a paint chip the size of my thumbnail and a name I recognized from a long time ago. I need to back up. My daughter Avery was 11 that fall, and she was at the age where she'd started noticing that other kids had things we didn't. Not in a mean way. She wasn't that kind of kid, but in a quiet, observant way that I found harder to answer than the loud kind. We lived in a semi-detached on Dunlop Street, the two of us, and a cat named Sargent who had claimed the good armchair as his permanent residence and treated me like a tenant he'd never fully approved of. Avery's mom and I had separated when Avery was 4. No dramatic story there. We just turned into two people who were better at being apart. She'd moved to Kelowna, remarried, had a good life. Avery spent summers there in the school year with me, and we'd made it work the way you do. Not perfectly, but honestly. I was getting by. That's probably the most accurate way to say it. The truck was paid off. The house payment was manageable. I wasn't behind on anything, but I also wasn't ahead of anything. There was a savings account I added to when I could and withdrew from when I had to, and the needle on that dial stayed pretty close to the middle. Most months, plumbing was enough. Some months, plumbing was tight. October was tight. So when Harriet from my answering service called about a job in Innisfil, big house, lakefront, owner had been dealing with a persistent pressure issue in the main supply line. I took it without asking too many questions. The contact name is Whitmore, Harriet said. Catherine Whitmore. She's been through 2 other companies already. Wants someone out there Thursday morning, first thing. I wrote down the address and forgot about it until Wednesday night when I punched it into my phone and saw the satellite image of the property and said a word out loud that I wouldn't have said if Avery had been in the room. The house sat on a private lot at the end of a road that didn't show up on most maps. It was the kind of place that didn't announce itself. No gate with a code pad, no intercom. Just a gravel lane through birch trees that opened up suddenly onto something that made you feel like you'd crossed into a different country. Timber frame, stone foundation, a dock that ran 40 feet out into Kempenfelt Bay. The kind of house that gets photographed for magazines, and then the magazine is careful not to say exactly where it is. I sat in my truck for a moment before I got out, just took a breath. The woman who answered the door was somewhere in her early 60s, though she carried it the way some people do, where the number feels like a technicality. Silver hair, pulled back. She was wearing a barn jacket over a cashmere sweater, and she had the look of someone who had been polite to contractors before and found the experience consistently unrewarding. "Mr. Kemp," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am, Travis Kemp." "You've got a supply line issue." She stepped back to let me in. The entryway was the size of my living room. There was a chandelier made of what looked like driftwood and antler that I later found out had been commissioned from an artist in New Brunswick. I didn't know that at the time. At the time, I was just trying not to drip on the floor, because the frost had finally made up its mind outside. She walked me through to the utility area, and she explained the problem, the way people who've had to explain things multiple times, please, efficiently, and with a slight weariness underneath. Low pressure throughout the house. 2 plumbers had come out, checked the obvious things, and left having done nothing that stuck. A company from Barrie she didn't name had sent a crew of 3 who'd spent a full day digging up a section of the supply line, replaced a fitting, charged her for 8 hours of labor, and the pressure was still dropping by Thursday evening. "Show me where they dug," I said. She took me around the side of the house, and I crouched down and looked at the backfill. and I already had a pretty good idea of what had happened, but I wanted to look at a few other things first. This is the part of the job I've always loved, and never been able to explain to anyone who doesn't do it. There's a logic to plumbing that runs deeper than the pipes. The pipes are just where the problem lives. The reason the problem lives there, that's something else. That takes time and quiet, and a willingness to look at things you weren't asked to look at. I asked if I could see the mechanical room. She walked me there. I asked about the age of the pressure tank. She said she didn't know. I asked if there'd been any work done on the well in the last 5 years. She said there had been, about 3 years ago. New pump, she thought, and she could find the invoice if I needed it. That would help, I said. She left to find it, and I stood there in that mechanical room by myself for a few minutes. And that's when I saw it. On the wall above the pressure tank, someone, probably a previous owner, probably a long time ago, had painted a small square in a color that I can only describe as a very specific shade of green. Not hunter green, not forest green. It was the color of old copper pipe left in the weather, a sort of teal gray that I had seen exactly once before in my life. Not on a wall. On a 71 Chevelle that belonged to a man named Roy Keelier. Roy Keelier had been my mentor. He was a plumber, too, 37 years in the trade when I apprenticed under him. He also spent his Saturdays restoring classic cars in a garage behind his house on Burton Avenue in Barrie, and the Chevelle was his masterpiece. He'd been working on it for 9 years when I met him, and he worked on it for 4 more before he finished it. And the color he'd mixed himself and called it copper birch, because he said it looked like a birch tree reflected in the Credit River in September. It was the most particular color I had ever seen, and I had never seen it anywhere else, and here it was, on the wall of Catherine Whitmore's mechanical room in a house on the lake in Innisfil. She came back with the invoice. I took it, and I looked at it, but I was still thinking about the paint. "Can I ask you something that's not about plumbing?" I said. She looked at me the way you look at a contractor who has just said something unexpected. "This house," I said. "How long have you owned it?" 8 years, she said. "We bought it from the estate of the original owner." "Do you know who that was?" She thought for a moment. "Keelier, I believe. That was the name on the title." I stood there for a second. "Roy Keelier?" She looked at me more carefully now. "You knew him?" "He taught me how to do this," I said. And I held up my pipe wrench, which was a stupid gesture, but it was the honest one. I want to tell you what Roy was like, because it matters for what happened next. Roy Keelier was 61 years old when I started working for him, which I know now is not as old as I thought it was then. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, slow-moving in the way that suggested he was never in a hurry, because he'd learned a long time ago that hurrying didn't get you there faster, it just tired you out for when you arrived. He had a thermos that was exactly the same shape as mine, which I only realized when I looked down at my hand in Catherine Whitmore's utility room and almost laughed out loud. He was not an easy man to apprentice under. He didn't explain things unless you asked, and sometimes he didn't explain them even then. He'd say, "What do you think?" and wait, and if you said you didn't know, he'd say, "Then look longer." I spent a lot of hours looking longer. But what he gave me, and I don't know how to say this without sounding like I'm overstating it, was the understanding that every problem a building has started as a decision someone made. A decision about what to use, where to put it, how much to spend. And if you understand the person who made the decision, you understand the problem. You don't just fix it. You understand it. He died in the winter, about 11 years after I'd finished my apprenticeship. I went to the service. His wife, a quiet woman named Edna, told me afterward that Roy had talked about me, that he'd said I was one of the good ones. I've held on to that for a long time. I'd had no idea he'd had a house on the lake. He built it himself, Catherine said, when I told her a little of this. She'd made tea without asking, which I appreciated, and we were standing at her kitchen island and I was trying to hold a mug with work-roo hands without making a mess of anything. Not by himself, obviously. But he managed the whole project. The previous realtor mentioned it when we bought, said he'd done most of the framing himself. That tracked. Roy would have done exactly that. "There's a workshop out back," she said. "We've kept it as is. Never quite knew what to do with it." I didn't say anything for a moment. "Would you mind if I looked at it after?" I said. "After you fix my pressure issue." she said with a slight smile that told me she was not unaware of the sequence she was establishing. Yes, I said. After. Here's what had happened with the pressure, and I'll spare you the detailed version. The crew who'd come out before me had replaced the wrong fitting. What they'd found was a symptom. The actual cause was a waterlogged pressure tank. The bladder had failed, which meant the pump was short-cycling, which over time had caused a microfracture in a section of pipe that they dug up and looked at, and, in their defense, the fracture was not obvious. But if you knew that Roy Keir had built this house, and you knew the way Roy thought about supply lines, you knew exactly what gauge of pipe he would have used and why, and you knew where the stress points were going to be over time. Because you'd watched him think through problems exactly like this for 4 years, and the fracture was in precisely the place Roy would have known it would eventually be. I had the pressure tank drained, and the bladder confirmed failed within 20 minutes. I had a replacement in my truck, not because I'd known, but because I carry 2 sizes and it happened to be the right one. The pipe section I could splice. It took me 43 minutes start to finish, and I want to be clear. I am not telling you this to say I was smarter than the crews who came before me. I'm telling you this to say that knowing Roy Keir was worth more to me in that mechanical room than any certification or any diagnostic tool I own. When the pressure came back up and the gauge settled and held, Catherine was standing in the doorway watching. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What was wrong?" I told her. All of it, including Roy, including why it mattered. She was quiet for a while after that. She walked over to the pressure gauge and looked at it, not because she needed to. She'd already seen it. But in the way people look at things when they're processing something that isn't really about the thing in front of them. "That workshop," she said finally. "Come on." The workshop was behind the house, set back from the water about 30 meters. Cedar siding that Roy would have put up himself. The pattern was too particular, too considered, to have been done by anyone who didn't care deeply about the outcome. The door was unlocked. I don't think it had a lock. Inside, it was exactly as I would have imagined if I'd tried to imagine Roy Keir's private place. Organized in a way that looked like chaos from the outside but wasn't. Every tool hung where it belonged. Every surface clear enough to work on. A shelf along the back wall with glass jars of hardware sorted by type. There was a workbench that ran the full length of the south wall, and above it, in the same copper birch green, someone had painted a stripe along the wall at eye level, just a couple of inches wide, all the way across, like a horizon line. I stood there and I did not say anything for quite a long time. Catherine stood beside me, and also did not say anything, which is the right thing to do when someone is standing in a place that means something to them. On the workbench, I noticed something I hadn't expected. In a clear plastic box, the kind you store small hardware in, with the little divided compartments, there was a collection of old plumbing fittings. Not random ones, specific ones. The kind from jobs I'd seen Roy do. And under the box, a folded piece of paper that had been there long enough to yellow at the folds. I looked at Catherine. She nodded, once. I unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn diagram, cross-section of a foundation wall with a supply line running through it. Roy's handwriting in pencil, which I recognized, annotated with measurements, and the kind of shorthand only someone who'd worked with him would understand. At the bottom, in bigger letters than the rest, he'd written, "The pipe doesn't fail. The decisions around the pipe fail. Don't fix the pipe, fix the thinking." I had heard him say that. In Roy's garage on Burton Avenue, on a Wednesday morning in November, the year I was 24 years old. I had heard him say those exact words, and I had written them in the back of my work notebook, which I still have, which is in my truck. I folded the paper back along its original creases and set it down on the workbench. "He kept all of this," I said. "It wasn't a question. We've never moved a single thing in here," Catherine said. I don't know why exactly. It didn't feel right to. I didn't know Catherine Whitmore's full story yet. I'd learn more of it over the following weeks. That her late husband, Gordon, had founded a logistics company that he'd sold in 2009 for a figure that made the Innisfil property look like pocket change. That Catherine now ran the foundation they'd established together, which funded early childhood programs across Norcasuro. That she had 2 grown daughters, and a son who disagreed with her about nearly everything, and loved her fiercely anyway. That she was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most influential private citizens in Simcoe County, and that she lived in this house 9 months of the year, largely because she found the lake calming and the drive to the Foundation's Barrie office manageable. I'd learn all of that later. That morning I knew almost none of it. What I knew was that she had kept Roy's workshop exactly as he'd left it, for 8 years, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, and that she was looking at me with an expression that told me this wasn't just about the plumbing anymore, and probably hadn't been since I'd said Roy's name in the mechanical room. "He was important to you," she said. "He made me who I am professionally," I said. "I don't know how else to put it." She looked at the diagram again. "He left notes like that everywhere," she said. "In the house, too. On the back of a light switch plate, in the hallway upstairs, on a beam in the basement that you can only see if you crouch down. My daughters thought it was odd when we first bought the place. I always thought it was something else." "What did you think it was?" "I thought he was someone who understood that everything he built would eventually be dealt with by someone he'd never meet," she said, "and he was trying to help them." I went back to my truck to write up the invoice. I sat there for a few minutes without writing anything. The job itself would come to $340. Labor, tank replacement, splice fitting, travel. It was a fair number. Less than what the previous crew had charged for doing the wrong thing, which had been just over $1,200. I wrote up the invoice and I went back inside. Catherine was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the water. She took the invoice and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me. "This is all?" she said. "That's all. The other company charged me 4 times this. They also didn't fix it," I said. She was quiet for a second, and then she almost smiled. "No, they didn't. She paid me. She also gave me a cup of tea and asked if I'd stay for a few more minutes, which I hadn't expected. And we stood at that kitchen island, and I told her more about Roy, about the Chevelle, about the thermos, about the way he'd look at a wall that was hiding a problem and go quiet, like he was listening to it. She told me about the first winter they'd spent in the house, how they'd had 3 separate small plumbing issues, and each time the repair had been simple because whoever had built the place had thought ahead so carefully. "We always assumed it was the builder," she said. "But it wasn't, was it?" "No," I said. "That would have been Roy." She walked me out. At my truck, she stopped. "Mr. Kemp," she said. "Travis," I said. "Travis." She looked toward the workshop for a moment. "That diagram, the one on the workbench. Yes? I'd like you to have it." I started to say something, and she held up one hand. "I kept that workshop because I didn't know who it belonged to," she said. "Now I do. Take the diagram. It belongs with someone who can read it." I drove back toward Barrie on the 400, and I didn't turn on the radio, which is unusual for me. I normally have something on. But I didn't want anything else in the truck with me. Avery was at school. I had 3 more calls that afternoon. I had a sandwich in my bag that I'd made at 6 in the morning and hadn't touched. The frost that had been undecided in the morning had made up its mind by noon. It was staying. And the birch trees on either side of Catherine Whitmore's lane had looked, as I turned out of it, exactly the color of copper left in the weather. I had the diagram on the passenger seat, still folded on its original creases. I thought about the way Roy used to finish a job. He would stand for a moment, not long, 30 seconds maybe, and he would look at what he'd done. Not checking it. He'd already checked it. He was doing something else. I used to think he was resting. I know now he wasn't. He was acknowledging it, saying, in some quiet internal way, "This was here, and it wasn't working, and now it is, and I understand why. I don't have a lot of days that feel like that. I have days that feel like I made it through, and days that feel like I did all right, and a few days a year that feel like I actually did something. That Tuesday in October was one of those." Avery asked me at dinner what I'd done that day. She was doing homework at the table while I made pasta, which is a habit I've been trying to break and mostly failing to. "Went out to a big house on the lake," I said. "Did you fix whatever was wrong?" "Yeah, what was wrong?" I thought about how to say it. Someone built it a long time ago, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and I knew him, and that's how I knew how to fix it. She looked up from her homework. "That's a weird answer. It's a weird thing to explain," I said. She went back to her homework. Sergeant came in from the living room, jumped up on the chair he'd claimed, and regarded both of us with the blank sovereignty of a cat who has no particular complaints. I thought about a question I'd almost asked Catherine before I left. I'd wanted to ask if she'd ever wondered why the workshop door had no lock. I had a theory about it, that Roy had built it without one on purpose, so that whoever came after him could get in without trouble, could use the tools, find the notes, understand the thinking. It was such a Roy thing to do that I was almost certain I was right. I didn't ask, in the end. Some things you don't need confirmed. You just know them, the way you know the sound of something working, when you've spent enough time listening to things that don't. There's a question I want to leave you with, because it's been sitting with me since that October morning, and I haven't been able to shake it. Think about the person who taught you the most important thing you know. Not a formal lesson, not something from a class or a training or a book. I mean the real thing. The way you approach a problem, or treat a stranger, or decide what's worth your time. Someone passed that to you, and they probably didn't know they were doing it. And there's a very good chance they're not here anymore for you to tell them what it meant. When was the last time you used what they gave you? And did you know, in the moment you used it, where it came from? Because I did. That Tuesday, standing in Roy Keir's mechanical room, in a house I'd never known he built, I used everything he gave me, and I knew exactly where it came from, and I fixed something that needed fixing, because one worn-out old plumber had once taken the time to teach a 24-year-old kid not just how to fix the pipe, but how to fix the thinking. And I don't know if that's worth telling. But here I am telling it anyway.